welcome all you
Well, thank you.
bonders out there. I am thrilled to be here today with Kate Loree. Did I say your last name right? Loree?
Yeah, accent on the last part, kind of like Marie. So Loree. Yeah.
Loree. Great. And you have a whole bunch of initials behind your name. Can you tell us what all your initials mean?
Sure. Well, when I was much younger, I got an MBA, which of course was not the right path for me. And then I got a marriage and family therapy degree with a focus in art therapy, and I'm a certified art therapist. And then later on, I also got certified in EMDR. So you'll see the MBA, LMFT, and ATR. So that's, that covers all of that and more. And, along with being certified in EMDR, I'm also a certified EDS or EDSE sex educator. So got all that under my belt.
What does EDSE mean?
Oh gosh, it's Ann Hodder-Ship's sex ed program. Everybody deserves sex ed. Yeah, so that's what that is. But basically across my life, I've almost been a psychotherapist for 20 years, just short of 20 years. And I actually, in my private life, I've been non-monogamous since 2003. Just a little history on me. I started out in a 11-year monogamous relationship, followed by a 13-year non-monogamous relationship and marriage, where we were pretty much started out as swingers and then kind of a hybrid model, and then later on pretty poly, and now that relationship has ended, but that's kind of where it all started as far as non-monogamy goes. So let's see, where do I start? And so I started out as a therapist, more as a trauma therapist, and working with, working in the clinics with people with sexual abuse or mental health and that sort of thing. So, but in my private life, I was non-monogamous. So both of those things kind of were going parallel. And then when I started my private practice and started immediately working with the non-monogamous community, kink community, LGBTQ, and porn performers, escorts were the folks that came to me. And I started working with more couples. I started to notice that couples therapy research and trauma therapy research seemed to run parallel, and there wasn't a lot of integration, which became more and more ludicrous to me, because it became very apparent to me that the thing that got in the way of intimacy between any two people, whether you have a triad or whatever, when is unresolved trauma. And so that's, now you let me know I'm starting to be long-winded, but I started to figure out different ways to integrate them. For instance, I discovered, well, I'll tell you that later, but well, let's see where you want me to go at this point, because I don't want to be too
fascinated by your what makes complete sense to me, your idea that of course trauma will inform how people
Express themselves and deal with each other in relationships, and it seems like not just marriages, but every kind of relationship with your siblings and your friends and your children and also partners, like everyone has trauma. Like, I don't know that I've ever met someone that has had like a trauma-free life. So we're all out here like with all these traumas trying to interact with each other. How do we do that?
Right. And let's face it, this is not just the realm of non-monogamous people. It's like, regardless of what your relationship model is, people have trauma. And I noticed that although there's all these brilliant books on non-monogamy, I wasn't seeing books that talked about all those things, like the non-monogamy, circle, the trauma circle, the couple, the therapy, relationship therapy circle. Like, how do these three things converge? Where is the Venn diagram crossover of those three things? So that's really a big part of what my book is. Like, in the title, it talks about conscious, compassionate relationships. It's a whole lot easier to eventually have a conscious, compassionate relationship if you have healed some of this stuff. but a lot of times people skip over that. And sometimes in non-monogamy, it seems like some thought leaders have really leaned hard on the cognitive piece. Like, I'm just going to mentally override this, I'm just going to do a reality check. But actually, when it comes to therapists, a lot of therapists believe that cognitive behavioral therapy is actually the most superficial therapy. Now you have working with your emotions is deeper, working with the body is even deeper, right? So, this is part of what my book is doing, is trying to go deeper. So I I like a Mario on Andretti speed, I go through the basics. That's part one. But really, to me, the introduction is important, but really the book starts at part two in my mind. I had to do the basics really quick, but it starts at part two.
What's part two about?
So many things. But if I go on the same line of what I'm talking about, I do talk about attachment theory, but then I go on to talk about attachment injuries. So within non-monogamy, because we're dealing with more relationships, the chances that our attachment injuries might be poked at, and that might happen at a higher rate than in monogamous relationship is pretty high. Right. So to me,
agree with that. Absolutely.
Yeah. So in my mind, we should look this bear right in the eye. And so, I talk in the book about the different attachment styles, like how to recognize if you're triggered. Like, and once you find out that you're triggered, how do you bridge back and find what does that connect to in your backstory? How to ground each other, how to ground yourself. All of this is more important. I get to the communication, the EPIC communication model. There's great communication models out there, right? Like nonviolent communication or imago dialogue. And none of those people that came up with those brilliant models ever say, oh, by the way, none of this will work if you're dysregulated in your body.
Can you just remind us what dysregulated is?
Well, if I were to use language from the Trauma Resource Institute, this is how they explain it. You can be in the high zone. In the high zone, when you're dysregulated, you may be having panic, rage, anger, or so that's the high zone. If you're in the low zone, you may feel dissociated, checked out, numb. And when you're in either, and your resilient zone is kind of in the middle, where you may feel happy, mad, sad, glad, you may cry, but you still feel relatively grounded in your body. But when you're in one of these zones, there's changes that have happened in the brain and in the body that compromise you in various ways. For instance, your prefrontal cortex is not working so well. And I think I can cuss here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So if you're dysregulated and you're up here, you're down here, and you're having a hard conversation in non-monogamy that has gotten super heated, and you call your partner a cunt or a bastard in that, and then the next day you wonder, like, why did I call my loved one that? I love them. Why would I do that? It might be because you're, in the high zone, and your prefrontal cortex that negotiates between emotion and reason wasn't working so well, and so that your filters were down. And so that's another thing I talk about in the book is how can you take a proper timeout? What I see in my practice is when they first come, they're not doing a proper timeout. They're going, fuck you, and they're stomping out, and that leaves the person feeling like the conversation has been disrespected, that they've been disrespected, and that maybe their partner is breaking up with them. And so I talk to them about doing a proper timeout, which is more to the extent of, look, I love you. And I know this conversation is important, but I need to go and ground myself. I'm going to go take a run. I'm going to go to the bathroom and do some deep breathing. I'll come back in fill in the blank amount of time, 10 minutes, an hour, what have you. And then this is still going to be hard, especially if the person waiting is, an anxious, ambivalent attachment style, but it's way better than how it usually goes down. And they come back and they can ground themselves and then move through the conversation. These are some of the things I talk about in the book.
So that's part of the EPIC?
Yeah, so epic. E is emotional, P is physical, I is intellectual, C is compassion and action. So the P, the physical, is running all through it. So it's not like a check off the box kind of model. So the physical might look like, so let's start over and say, Sarah says to Bob, I'm really upset because last night at our play party, you were making out with Veronica and you broke my garden gnome, which was my last gift from my great grandmother. It was the last thing that I had from her. And you haven't apologized and you haven't said a peep, and it's been 24 hours later. And I'm really sad and disappointed, etc. And so perhaps Bob at this moment, he's had a hard day, but maybe he tells her he needs to go take a moment and go to the bathroom and come back, take some deep breaths. Or maybe he says to her, okay, before we even get started, let's sit on the sofa. Is there anything you need to ground yourself? Like for me, doing just some deep breathing with you would help. Or right now, like holding your hand would help. What would work for you? And she might, if she's too mad, she might be at that place where she's like, don't touch me. But maybe she's not like in that space. Maybe she says, you know what, if we just laid on the bed in the spoon position, if you could be the big spoon while I talk to you and while we talk this out, that would be grounding to me. Just do the whole big spoon, little spoon. He's like, absolutely, we can do that. So now we're starting with
That's a great idea.
Yeah, yes. So now we can move to E, to the emotional piece. Again, this doesn't have to go in a particular order once you understand the heartbeat of it. So the emotional is making sure that you understand and you are reflecting back the emotional piece, the empathizing. So he's looking for emotional words. Like, perhaps she said the following, he says, well, I'm hearing that you're disappointed in me, that you're upset, that you're sad. Is there anything else? And he tries to pull out as much emotional language as possible. And maybe she's like, I'm really frustrated at you too, okay. And at that point, maybe he also notices that she's starting to tense up, and he's like, and maybe he just mentions that. He doesn't try and interpret it, because a lot of times that can go south. He just says, I'm noticing you're tensing up. Is there anything that can help? Can you pet my head? Yes. So now he's petting her head. They're in the spoon position, and he moves on to I. Once she says, if he says something to the effect of, does that sound true? Is there anything else? No, there's nothing else. I feel like you understand what I'm feeling right now. Moving to I, the intellectual piece. This is the validation piece. We all want to feel validated. Most of us have memories of being a little kid and going, I feel sick, and our mom saying, you're just trying to get out of school. We all have memories of being invalidated when we were vulnerable. And so validation is that part where you might say to your partner, I intellectually understand why you're upset, because you loved your great grandmother so much, and that was the last thing you had from her. So this intellectually makes sense to me. Now, sometimes you may not agree with them, but a lot of times you can find something, or you can repeat back how they're viewing it. There's a way to validate no matter what, even when you don't completely agree. And then once all of that is done, and they feel seen, they feel like you get it intellectually, emotionally, then you can probably work to the compassion and action. A lot of people want to start with this, with the problem solving piece. And that leaves the person feeling invalidated and like you don't get what they're emotionally experiencing, that you're just skipping over that. So that always needs to go last. So the compassion and action, is there anything I can do to make this better? Well, yeah, on Yelp, there's actually a garden gnome fixer down the street that you can call, and he's like, great, I'll do that. Now, at this point, it may switch, now that it may be that he ends up holding the emotional baton at some point. That can get tricky, and that may be outside of the scope of this conversation, because when we switch it, that's a key place, because if it isn't done well, she can feel like everything that was done before it has been undone. So, maybe he's like, look, I know it was bad, but I got laid off at work and my friend died. You know, he might have reasons why he didn't
Right,
attend to
yeah.
it, you know, and that's a whole piece, but that gives you a taste of what the model is about. And at the end, it may finish with P again, like, you know, with the physical part again. Okay, now that we've moved through this, is there anything that you need? You know, I just want to roll over and just give you a hug, because I really do feel like, you know, we moved through something that I was really upset about, and now I'm feeling better, and I just like a hug, you know?
Yes. Wow, that sounds just like a fascinating book. Thank you so much.
For giving us that overview. I love that idea.
Yeah, yeah.
Right before we started, you were talking a little bit about your writing process, and I thought it was really interesting. Related to this book specifically, and it sounded, I'm not sure if this is accurate, but it sounded almost like this book kind of happened to you. It was like, write me, hello, write me. Is that, I'm going to look for while you answer that, I'm going to look for the link to your book. Or is there a link that's the best one for you that has, like, if people link to your book, that provides cash back or something for you, you know, whatever.
Oh, I don't have anything like that set up.
Okay.
I will say this, that, you know, if you are planning to buy the paperback, let's support our independent bookstores. Like if you live in Los Angeles, why not buy from Skylight Books or Book Soup or The Last Bookstore? You know, and even set up an account with them and make a point to buy from our independent bookstores. But at the end of the day, the book is available wherever books are sold, and it's available in 3 formats: Kindle, paperback, and audiobook. Yeah.
Wonderful. So can you tell us about writing your book?
I sure can. And just to put a bow on what we were just talking about, I was just giving you a few like Baskin Robbins taster spoons. Actually, the book is about way more, but it's just, it takes forever to explain everything in the book. But answering your question, oh goodness, you know, I feel like, so I tend to want to answer it in a long-winded way. That's kind of my style. So my family are Canadians on my mother's side, and my grandpa was head of the educational psych department of the University of Alabama. So my family are on my mom's side are progressive Canadians, even though I grew up in Alabama. And I think everything that I am today is in reaction to what I experienced in Alabama, because I did experience a lot of misogyny, witnessed a lot of racism, et cetera, and so on. And certainly a lot of sex shaming left, right, and center of me and people that I loved, for sure. So, you know, when I ended up coming to Los Angeles, I would say in times, you know, my life, I've driven my destiny, and in other ways, life has pulled me along. And, you know, and there's a whole bunch of things that happened before writing this book. I think one thing that started to happen was like back between 2014, 2016, I did a BuzzFeed video that got over 6 million views, and I was doing some public speaking, and both people, when I'd speak, and also my clients were asking me to write this book. And then also, this gets woo-woo. I warned you that I'm a little spiritual. I'm pretty spiritual, not religious. I was doing this.
Woo on.
Huh?
Woo on.
I'm about to woo for sure. So sometimes I do either holotropic or pranayama breathwork meditations. And for some people, they see visions when they do it. I'm one of those people that I'll see visions when I do it. And usually I just get in the way. In general, when visions happen, it's way different than dreaming or daydreaming. It's way more vivid, and it doesn't feel like it's coming from me. It feels like it's coming from something else. That's how I describe it. And in general, when I'm doing it, if I try and dictate, it'll just go black. I have to like completely let go and watch it like I'm watching a movie. And But every now and then my ego gets in the way and I try and drive the car, and this is one of those moments where I was watching this blue panther that was always showing up. And this blue panther in my visions has kind of like Grace Jones energy. She's very fierce. And I tried to ask her about my love life. What about men? And she kind of just scoffed and just said, just write your freaking book, so like, so that's very woo-woo, but I'm just saying that whether it was clients or people listening to me speak or in the spiritual realm, just everything was pushing me towards writing this book.
Well, congratulations. I know that it can just be a grueling and challenging process. So congratulations and huge success.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was lucky. Jamie Waxman, you may know who Jamie Waxman is. She's a sex educator. She referred me to Brooke Warner. I had written the book and done 6 waves of cleaning the book up. And then I hired Brooke Warner as a developmental editor, and we slowly went through it for a year, just cleaning it. So taking my rough diamond into a polished diamond. And then there was, of course, editors and all of that. So it was a 5-year process.
Absolutely. I believe that. Absolutely.
Yes.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I feel now it's just it's like getting a little birdie to like be able to fly on its own at this point.
Yes, absolutely. That's so exciting. So you mentioned you had practiced psychotherapy for 20 years?
Just short of 20 years. I started doing psychotherapy while I was still in school, with my first practicums. And, I think it was in 2003 that I had my first job where they gave me the title of behavioral therapist when I was still in school. So, so if you count all of that, then yeah, it's just short of 20 years.
And it sounded like you provided counseling and therapy to a range of sex and gender minorities, if I was
interpreting you correctly, like a diverse range of people kind of out on the edges of conventional sexuality.
I think that really started in 2011 when I started my private practice. When I was working in the clinics, that was probably going on there too, but they really kind of steer you away from talking about sex at those clinics. Yeah. And anytime you try and talk about sex, because most people had a lot of sexual abuse, they would very quickly go to the sexual abuse that they had experienced. Because, in the clinics I worked with, there was a lot of heavy sexual abuse. They weren't ready to talk, or they, how should I put, they resisted talking about their sexual human potential because they were still trying to heal from a gang rape or a huge molestation history. And, yeah, so there was all that. But like I said, in my private life, I had been non-monogamous. I was becoming friends with people that were porn performers and, like all of this stuff. And so when I started my private practice in 2011, I had just said that I was thinking about it, and I literally had clients before I had a space. I had to hustle to get a space because I was getting phone calls saying, I heard that you're about to start your private practice. I want to hire you because people want a sex positive therapist that have actually walked the walk and, haven't just read about non-monogamy, but are non-monogamous. And
Absolutely.
So things started building fast in 2011. And yes, I have a variety of clients in terms of, as I've mentioned, there are a lot of folks that are various forms of non-monogamous, a lot of kinky clients. Actually, they came first. The kinky clients came first, which I didn't expect. And then a good bit of diversity in terms of, gender, race, etc.
Sorry, someone asked a question and I didn't understand it, so I asked them to clarify. So you were talking about trauma in general, and then you brought up sexual trauma, which I think is, trauma is everywhere. Like pretty much everybody has trauma, and so many people have sexual trauma.
Mm-hmm.
How do people get over that? How do they heal?
Mm-hmm.
Things like that.
Yeah, well, it doesn't
That
show.
question, let me just ask, do you have space in your practice? I know that a lot of therapists are full up, and it sounds like you've got quite the following. Do you have any room, or are you full?
It varies, it varies. And yeah, it's one of those things that right now I'm being careful with how many people I take in, because I am doing a lot right now in terms
Mhm.
of getting the book out there. So every now and then I'll take somebody on, and it just depends. It doesn't hurt to reach out to me, and then we can see if we're the right fit for each other. Yeah, but right now I'm not taking on a whole bunch of clients, because I already have folks that have been with me for a very long time, but every now and then I do. Yeah, let's see. And you asked me another question. What was?
About how to heal from trauma,
Yes. Well, one thing
especially
is,
sexual trauma.
one thing that I've noticed, and I think it's changing now, but still every now and then you'll hear people, just like people out in the world talk about a particular diagnosis, whether it's BPD or trauma,
Could you spell that out? Just
borderline personality disorder. And they'll talk about it like that disorder comes off of an assembly line and that each person is the same. Whereas it can show up, like for instance, trauma. If you have sexual abuse, how you present can really vary from person to person, and so how I might treat one person may be slightly different than another person, depending on how their symptoms show up. Like one person their trauma might manifest with them having heavy borderline personality disorder symptoms, and another person may not have that at all, and it's more PTSD. Or maybe it shows up as DID, dissociative identity disorder, and that's a whole different ballgame. So how you heal depends on how it's showing up in your body. And, EMDR is a really powerful modality. I use that a lot. Some trauma, like you can probably think in your life, and there's probably been some traumas that you've had where you could just talk it out with a friend and it moved through and it was fine. But for trauma that it's not moving through, when you have a talk therapist or what have you, and you're still getting triggered, you still jump when someone slams the cabinet doors, or you're still having nightmares, whatever, then either somatic psychotherapy or EMDR are really great modalities. I tend to because I've been the therapist for a long time, I tend to fuse a lot of things together. Like I might fuse EMDR, somatic psychotherapy, and art therapy all together. Or I might fuse EMDR, somatic psychotherapy, and a big tribal drum that the client brings in. Like I fuse all kinds of different things, and pretty witchy in how I go about things, so to speak. EMDR, I'll just say it would take 25 minutes for me to really flesh out what that is. But I'll just say it's almost like Excalibur's sword for therapists. Like you just need to be a good enough therapist. And this modality takes things next level. It's light years more powerful than talk therapy. I've been around people, when I first started hearing about it, I thought it sounded a little kooky. But then I started hearing about 9/11 firefighters saying, I tried to heal, nothing was helping, but I'm getting my life back now that I've done EMDR. And then I started witnessing it in the clinics, where we had clients that had the worst kind of backstory. Maybe they were sexually abused by their mom for years when they were a child, the kind of client that would be in the basement in the fetal position and couldn't be touched, and all their artwork in my art therapy groups was like black, and all that. I started watching them do EMDR with some of the other therapists, and all of a sudden they were smiling, they could be touched, they were going to parties, their artwork completely shifted to being colorful over time. And I thought, I am getting trained in this as soon as I'm in my private practice, which I have. Now I've been doing it for years. And not only does it help individuals, but also with couples, regardless of what the non-monogamous formation is at home, people always come to me either as individuals or as couples. And so when I have two people that come in, a lot of times they have a double trigger that shows up in their arguments. Shall I explain that, or is that getting too long?
Please, yes.
Okay. So I'll give you an example. Like say, what are our names? Mike and Sammy. So Mike and Sammy are dating. Mike was abused. He was bullied when he was a kid. And so when people get big in their tone, he has a tendency to cower because he has some unresolved stuff. And Sammy, when she was young, her dad was an alcoholic, and her mom would always ask her to take care of dad, and she resented that. And so she resents men that she perceives as weak, and she will get loud and big in the presence of a man that appears weak in her eyes. So when they get into an argument, it becomes a chicken or the egg situation. But if Mike starts to cower, she starts getting big. And the bigger she gets, the more he cowers, and then it spirals. So that's a double trigger. And some couples have many double triggers, and some couples have double triggers that are bigger than others. And so I'm always looking for it. And once I find it, then I'll do individual sessions with each person on the EMDR. I'll do EMDR with this person on their double trigger moment, and wait for that to kind of filter through their body a couple of weeks. And then I'll do this person, whatever their double trigger is. And usually after I've done that, the next time they have that same argument, it's way diffused, or they can easily move through the discussion with very little trouble, or it's at least, diffused quite a bit. I've been able to save marriages that way.
That's fantastic. So they get kind of frozen in this dynamic, and the EMDR breaks that up a little bit, and they're able to reconfigure that.
That's fantastic. I have heard so many good things about EMDR, and have actually tried it with several different therapists myself. And I have found that it's not always the magic bullet for everyone. So just if you're out there and you didn't go in 5 minutes from drawing dark black pictures to going to a party, after like one EMDR session.
Or was it like the example that was over time?
Yes. But I think that sometimes people feel that, people for whom EMDR is not this magic bullet, hear people talking about like, oh, I did EMDR and I went from hiding in the basement to going to a party. And it's just not, first of all, it doesn't, as you very rightly point out, Kate, it doesn't happen that way in real life. You don't, it's not a 5-minute thing. But I think it can feel like that, especially as someone who's like, I've tried it and it's not all that.
Yeah, and certainly
I've talked to other people who have also felt like, oh, I'm a failure because EMDR doesn't work for me. And I just wanted to kind of give perspective on it.
So on that note, two things. One, not all therapists are the same. A lot of times when a client comes to me and they say they've done EMDR before, I'll ask them, did you have a good or bad experience? And I'll ask them to describe it. And I've heard descriptions of how other therapists are doing EMDR where I'm like, well, of course you didn't feel safe. And of course that didn't work because of how they were going about it. So that can be why. Maybe they just had a therapist that just was doing it in a way that didn't work, or the therapist wasn't that good at it, or both. But also, like going back to my book, I realized one of the reasons I wrote that book is because there are so many people that need help that can't afford a therapist. So I tried to put as much knowledge as I could into that book. And I mentioned EMDR, but I also wrote it from the standpoint of trying to give some people skills who can't afford EMDR. And like, what do you do if you have trauma and you're getting triggered in your non-monogamous relationship? You can't afford EMDR and you need to figure out how to manage things. So, that's a big part of what the book is about, is figuring out how to manage things when you can't afford something like EMDR.
That's fantastic.
So it's really kind of a user's manual in a way for people who are struggling with trauma.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was talking to a psychotherapist who works with drugs, like not in the sense of working with heroin addicts, but she's the type that will go out to a festival and try and make sure that people that are doing psychedelics are that, you know, she's reducing harm, and that sort of thing. And she read my book, and her response was that it's a harm reduction model, which was interesting because in my mind, I was trying to help people have the ideal, the conscious, compassionate relationship. But yes, we have to start at our foundation and try and clear our trauma as much as possible, have that strong foundation. And from there, we can build up to the ideal of the conscious, compassionate, non-monogamous relationship formations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Circle back to something you said.
Before, I just thought was fascinating. You said that even when people are in multiple partner relationships, they tend to come in ones or twos. And actually, that's been my experience too as a coach. So I'm just wondering why you think that is.
Well, you know, I know people talk about kitchen table poly and stuff like that, but at the end of, you know, at the end of the day, I think no matter what the relationship formation is, there's usually two people that talk to each other, and then this person goes off and talks to this person. Like it's always more of a dyadic conversation that happens. Even if they're doing everything in their power to break down any kind of privilege, couples privilege, they're doing their best to make sure that everyone is heard and considered. Now, you know, why is that? I think a lot of it has to do with things like having kids and responsibilities, and life has a lot of responsibility. We don't usually have time to coordinate 5 people to be in a room to hash something out. You know, it's like life is too complicated, especially out here in LA, you know, where I'm working sometimes with movie directors and, you know, like people that are incredibly busy.
Right.
And so, and then also, yeah, and also if you think about it, usually people are hiring me for a 50-minute session. Sometimes people do a session and a half, but usually it's 50 minutes. As soon as you add a person, now these other 2 people are not getting heard as much. So again, and a few times I've had people bring in 3, and I'm always like, we need a session and a half if you're going to do that. And it's even that's going to go by like that.
Yeah.
And I find that those conversations, how should I put it? It adds to the complexity as soon as you have 3 people in the space. I think that's part of it too. So I think there's time constraints, money constraints, emotional gas tank constraints. These are a few of the factors. We could probably think of more, but I think people are just trying to reduce the complexity, and non-monogamy is a more complex model.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say maybe I see triads and quads
Perhaps together more often, because I often deal with issues of parenting. And if they're all talking about the kid, I think they're much more likely to come see me for like family issues as a group. And I agree, it's the more people you get, the more challenging, especially because I usually work remotely. So that's a challenge, you know, on Skype and Zoom and things like that.
Yeah, and then also you've written The Polyamorous Next Door, you know, and books like that kind of, you know, shape you as someone who knows a lot about the poly family, like, you know, all living together in a house. Whereas my brand, if you will, is being like a little bit of this hybrid therapist that knows non-monogamy in all these communities, but also knows things like mental health and trauma. And so I think that tends to make, I don't know, there's an intimacy in that, I think, maybe people just want it to be 1 or 2 people.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if all y'all who are listening out there, do you have any questions? Please drop them in the chat. You can either drop them in the regular chat or drop them in the Q&A thing.
I know I had at least one more question for you on my little list. You had mentioned something about self-compassion, which I thought was really interesting. How do you cultivate? Well, maybe let's start with what is it, and then how to cultivate it.
Well, one, if you feel like your self-compassion is low, Kristen Neff's book on self-compassion is so good. It's such a great book. You know, if you think, you know, how should I put it? I'm not one to give like these little cookie cutter definitions. So, you know, I think another way of thinking of self-compassion is self-love, you know, self-love in action. I've heard some people describe the difference between empathy and compassion is that empathy is more like having, you know, being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And compassion is more like seeing that there is a problem and then doing something to fix it. And there's actually some studies that say that compassion can actually sometimes be more helpful than empathy, because in empathy, sometimes we get overwhelmed and unable to help. Whereas compassion is more focused on just seeing there's a problem and doing something about it. So you sometimes are less likely to get flattened by it. You know, when you think about it, usually when we're talking about empathy or compassion focused on others, when we're thinking about ourselves, perhaps we can hold on to that piece of, you know, loving ourselves from the standpoint of an action model. You know, I think within non-monogamy, there's a lot of things that can get in the way of having self-compassion. And my book lists a whole bunch of different things that get in the way. One thing that I talk about is different ego states and how that plays a part. Now, the different ego states you're used to hearing are different. The ones I use are, because this is just what it feels like in my practice, it feels like the warrior, the child, and the nurturer. So the warrior I would categorize as that person that kicks ass and takes names, the person that is, you know, driven, gets the book written, you know, gets to work on time, runs the marathon, like kicks ass and takes names. The warrior tends to dislike the child. Now the child, in someone that still has a lot of injuries, that is usually the wounded inner child. I believe that when you heal that inner child, it doesn't poof disappear. It becomes more like this happy muse, this happy 3-year-old, you know, that adds joy to your life and helps you play. But typically the warrior hates that injured child. And then there's the nurturer who kind of negotiates between the two. And I find that with people that have poor self-compassion, their warrior is ruling the show, and that inner child is metaphorically in a basement, in a closet with a whole bunch of locks and the lights turned off. Now, when, you know, and so a lot of times that person that's not listening to their inner child, that can show up a lot of ways. Usually the warrior does think very logically. And so when people are asking things of them within non-monogamy, or they're trying to figure out what is right, they're thinking from a logical standpoint, and they can end up, because they're not also listening to their emotions and their body sensations, because I feel like that's, you know, that's your full compass, your thoughts, your emotions, your body sensations working in tandem from a grounded, centered place. You're just working with your intellect. A lot of times you can say yes to things that are not a true yes, you know. And over time, you can end up having generalized anger, generalized anxiety, or a lot of different things if you've progressively said yes to a lot of things in non-monogamy that are not a true yes. You know, so when you bring that child out of the closet and you start to listen to her, and you bring in the nurturer who's going to say, look, warrior, you're a badass, but we're only going to be as healthy as the whole system is healthy. And we need to listen to this part that's injured. And as we do, that part of ourselves will get lifted up and our whole system will become healthier. You know, this is part of building compassion. Another piece, again, I've talked about healing our attachment injuries. Part of self-compassion is working on healing those unresolved attachment injuries. And the last thing that I'll just mention, again, just giving you a taster spoon of a few things, is our level of positive affect tolerance. A lot of people, especially if we have a trauma history, it may be that their positive affect tolerance is a bit in the pooper, so
what does that mean, positive affect tolerance?
The way I'm using it, it's basically our tolerance for experiencing the yumminess of life. Now, you might think to yourself, why would I have to build up a muscle for tolerating the yumminess of life? Well, because there's vulnerability in that. If you have been abused a lot as a child, if your backstory is one where you have been betrayed and you don't trust others, then literally leaning into joy, leaning into being loved well by multiple people, etc., and so on, can really push that positive affect tolerance wall. And when we are in a zone that's beyond where our positive affect tolerance will allow, we sometimes have a tendency to sabotage, recoil, lash out, all kinds of things in order to initially create a little fight or whatever, but the end result is reestablishing the level of intimacy that we're comfortable with, where we may be comfortable in the discomfort of our previous state. But the more we build our positive affect tolerance, then the more we can tolerate multiple loves, the more we can really tolerate loving ourselves well, the more we'll have self-compassion. All of this builds the more we work on our positive affect tolerance. And I'll just say one last thing with positive affect tolerance, it's not across the board. So it may be that you can tolerate people saying you're badass at your job, but if someone gives you a compliment, it may feel like an itchy sweater that you want to throw across the room. If it's a compliment about, I don't know, the way you look or something that's outside of your profession. So it's not across the board. It's like, and when you find a place that your positive affect tolerance is weak, then you can build that up like a muscle, but by leaning into that particular thing, which is a whole conversation.
Fantastic. Fantastic. It sounds to me like you might have some great ideas about
self-soothing. That's one of the things I see in my clients quite a bit, is having strong self-soothing skills allows them to kind of ride through difficult periods if their partner is having NRE with someone, new relationship energy, where they're really excited about someone else, for instance, if they have strong self-soothing skills. And I wonder if do you have ideas about how people can appropriately self-soothe? Because I feel like a lot of us self-soothe with things that in the long run make things worse, like drugs and alcohol. Some alcohol is fine, but if you're using it as your primary self-soothing source, that has a limited shelf life,
Right. Yeah. Well, I would say, there's a million things that you can do to self-soothe that are the things that you'll just hear coaches say, like go pet your cat, hang out with a friend, these kind of things. But so let's just skip over that because everybody's heard the stuff, that kind of thing, and go to something a little bit deeper than that. I think two wheelhouses start with tracking your body, and the other wheelhouse is resourcing, and those two work together. So for a lot of people, again, they live up in their head and they're not even tracking their body. They may do that because of trauma, where, like being in your body, it feels like a war zone. It doesn't feel safe. Or I think there's many reasons. Another reason might be internalized misogyny, because let's face it, we've been raised with man, logical, good, woman, emotional, bad. And so anything that has to do with the body or emotions, so we have been told that is lesser, because we have been told that's feminine energy and therefore bad, which all of this is bullshit on multiple levels. But this is another reason sometimes we live up in our head. So as we start to track our body, that may be hard at first, like especially, but if you track for the positive, that's one place that you can start. You can track for the positive, and whatever you focus on gets bigger. If you couple that with resourcing, like you can either, like maybe your resource is your pet, and maybe you sit on your lap, you have your pet on your lap and you're petting your animal while you are noticing what part of your body knows about how wonderful your animal is. And so maybe you notice that your heart is warm. And as you focus on that warmth while petting your cat, you notice the warmth is expanding. And maybe you get ninja with this and you say to yourself, I'm going to let every cell in my body know about this warmth. And you can get to a point where you can do that. This is one way to get your whole body to calm down and to resource and ground yourself. Now, trauma research, they started with the body, and they found out that, war vets that have been through several tours of duty, that they focused on the body first, that actually was too dysregulating to them because they had just so much trauma. And so for some people, being that body base may be a hard place to start. If you're in that camp, what trauma researchers have found is just thinking about the positive resource. Like for me, a positive resource is going onto my porch and watching the hummingbirds and all the trees with my 3 cats around me, and just that whole symphony completely grounds my body. But I don't have to think about my body. I can just think about all those things, and then the body shifts. And so that's what trauma therapists realize with these folks with several tours of duty, that they could just focus on these resources, and then the body would react in a grounding, centering way without them ever even thinking about their body. But you can couple the two if it works for you that way.
That is fantastic. I just love the way you bring everything back to the body, because, like we do live in our minds so much in this highly digitized world. And it's almost like you need to be successful in a Zoom setting, you need to stifle your body, kind of.
Right. So whether you're
still.
At the end of the day, it all comes back to the body. If you read any of the top trauma researchers, all their books are called things like The Body Keeps the Score, The Body Bears the Burden. So if you're trying to heal trauma or trying to ground yourself, it ends up with the body. If you're trying to go next level, and again, back to the spiritual woo-woo, it again goes to the body. So whether you're trying to just manage the worst thing or reach your human potential, in both cases, it goes back to the body.
Attention to the body.
All you have to do is talk to somebody who's into Tantra or, some other things related to Tantra, and they will agree with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So now that you've finished this huge project, this exciting book, what's next for you?
When you ask that, do you mean professionally or personally?
Whatever you want to tell us about.
Well, as far as professionally goes, I think I'm at a place where I kind of have my ear to the ground, and I'm just seeing what everyone wants from me next. Let's see what happens with this book. Let's see how people react to it. Let's see what people want more of. Let's see what capacity they want me to show up. Do they want me, is the universe pulling me towards TV or more being writing more books? I'm going to be listening to all that and then making a decision based on that. Because there's a lot of things that interest me, from being on TV more to, if I inherit a lot of money, having a little micro echelon, like a little property with some yurts, and had people come in that are either, people like you, like healers, speakers, or musicians or artists, and having a little community that people could come to, fly into, like that is, interesting to me. Doing retreats is interesting to me in beautiful locations. At the end of the day, what's interesting to me is fusing psychology and creativity and imagination in a way that makes this world better. And if I can go next level in a way that just doesn't help my practice, but can help a much larger expanse of people, I'm incredibly interested in that. So how it shows up, there's a lot of things that I would say yes to. Personally, I am looking forward to traveling. I'd like to go to 3 countries in Africa and be there for like a month or something. I'd like to go to Costa Rica. I've never been there. There's a lot of travel I want to do. I'd like to spend some time getting my joy on, because I've been pretty isolated just writing with my 3 cats. I'd like to expand and be joyful and hang out with my friends and reconnect all of that again. So that's a little bit of both the professional and the personal.
That just sounds fantastic. You are fascinating and so incredibly knowledgeable, so well trained with so many good ideas. I have just loved this conversation.
Thank you. I think our bonders might be kind of blown away by the amount of information they've gotten today. This was a lot of really useful, interesting, and dense information. This was like a packed.
Yeah, well, just to let you know, when I wrote that book, I very much wrote it as if I was sitting at a coffee shop holding somebody's hand, and we're just like hanging out and we're talking. It's a book that is very friendly, so I don't want people to think it's like this dry, heavy, I've done everything in my power to make it feel warm, friendly, and fun to read, despite the fact that it covers a lot of different topics and a lot of intense stuff.
Heavy topics, but accessibly written, not aimed at a PhD level audience, but more at people who would use it for themselves.
There was a few people that pushed me towards writing for the academic world, and I'm like, no, at this point, I have no interest in doing that. There's so many people out there, again, that can't afford therapy, etc. I want to write a book for them that they would have fun reading, that will help them go next level.
Well, I have found this fascinating. I sure hope that we see a lot more of you on the bonding project. You are just such an interesting person with such fascinating things to say. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on. I've already told you how I feel about you. I think you're an epic human, and to just share a space with you, it feels like a little reward or a little prize.
Oh, that's so sweet of you to say. Thank you.
So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for the bonding hour. This has been Dr. Eli Sheff with Kate Loree. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.